welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AIIVIC, and very warm welcome to members of AIIA, our other guests, and members of the Diplomatic Corps joining us today. The usual brief Zoom housekeeping at the outset. We'll take questions towards the end. Please feel free to start typing your questions at any point in the Q&A tab in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as we can. So to today's much anticipated webinar, and to discuss Biden's America and great power conflict, we're delighted to host a speaker whom we've been trying, frankly, for years to secure, David Kilcullen. David is a former soldier and diplomat, but moreover, a scholar of guerrilla warfare, of terrorism, counterinsurgency, urbanization, and the future of conflict, on which he's written a number of very thought-provoking books. He served for 25 years with the Australian and US governments, and now he's Professor of International and Political Studies at UNSW Canberra, and serves also as Professor of Practice in Global Security at Arizona State University. So welcome to Australia, David. Our interlocutor, Richard Iron, President of AII Victoria, but formerly served for 37 years with the British Army on a number of interesting overseas deployments. He was visiting fellow at Oxford University's Changing Character of War program and was lead editor of British Generals in Blair's Wars. So Richard, I will now hand over to you, and thank you both very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
David, I'd like to start with the United States before moving on to China, Russia, and Iran later in the conversation. Now, the popular perception here in Australia is that we finally got someone sensible in the White House. That with President Biden, we can look forward to a more coherent strategy, less offensive rhetoric, and de-escalation of tension. Now, do you think this is in fact all true? In addition to the great change of tone coming out of the White House, are we seeing a fundamental shift in American strategy globally?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. And it is great to finally connect. And Richard, obviously, we've known each other for, I was thinking the other day, about 25 years. So yeah. You can probably, as we say in America, call bullshit on anything that I come up with that doesn't sound about right. But look, as I'm looking at the US right now, I'm struck with the comment of a wit on one of the many blogs who described the incoming Biden-Harris government as bourbon Democrats. In other words, bourbon restoration after the revolution and the unpleasantness of the last 4 years, and pointed out that, like the Bourbons, they've learned nothing and forgotten nothing. And certainly the restoration rhetoric is very strong in the way that President Biden has spoken on a number of occasions. This notion of America is back. We are regaining our seat at the head of the table, and didn't you all miss us? That rhetoric, I think, actually rings quite hollow. And it rings hollow for three reasons. One, the world is different than it was the last time the Democrats were in the White House. The Iranian nuclear program, for example, is dramatically far advanced compared to a few years ago. Islamic State, which was the #1 problem in the last year of the Obama administration, has been defeated in a conventional sense. We've had the massive disruption of COVID-19, and I think China in particular is a very different global competitor than it was perceived at any time in the past, certainly during the Obama administration. So the world's different, but the US is also different. US has alienated a lot of its allies. Its credibility has been hurt in a number of international forums. The fiasco of the COVID-19 response in the US, massive fiscal stimulus. I mean, 40% of US dollars that have ever existed were printed in 2020. Enormous internal unrest with about 500 cities experiencing arson and rioting since last summer. And then, of course, the so-called invasion of the Capitol. So that now the you've got an armed camp, green zone on the Potomac in Baghdad. You've got a regime that is increasingly telegraphing that it's scared of its own population and scared of its own military forces in the way that it's responding to them. And I think that means that America in 2021 is different to what it was in 2016. And then finally, on a brief personal point, I think that President Biden's different. When he was the vice president, I briefed him for hours on Afghanistan. I always found him to be extremely sharp, very engaged across the detail. I disagreed with many of his policy preferences, but I never thought that he didn't understand fully the details of what was being discussed. That's not the same person that I see in a lot of his current pronouncements. So I think that, the short answer is, like the Bourbons, these guys are going to try to restore the ancien regime in Washington. I don't think they're going to succeed because of those reasons I mentioned.
I mean, and probably the most important being the lack of cohesion in the American people. Do you sense that he is trying to build bridges across the population now?
Not so far, but it is very early days, so we need to give him a chance. Certainly the early period of the Biden administration has been consolidating control of certain key elements of the government, but it's also been an attempt to roll back or reverse a whole series of signature policies on the part of President Trump. So I think it was 37 executive orders in his first 2 weeks, which is a high number historically. Not really directed at unification. Now, you could argue that his political strategists decided, look, there's an impeachment going on of President Trump, who is now, of course, both the most impeached and the most acquitted president in US history. So we may as well, take a sort of Jeff Kennett approach, if we remember that far back in the 90s, and do all my damage early, do all the things I need to do that people may not find congenial at the beginning while all this other stuff is in the spotlight, and then pivot to a unification agenda afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one of the most frightening things of this century so far, to me, has been the extent to which liberal democracy as a philosophy and political system has retreated in the face of authoritarianism. Partly due to the USA's retreat from global leadership, but also because of its loss of moral standing after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Can we hope that the Biden presidency is the start of the global fight back, if I can put it in those terms, the fight back of liberalism against authoritarianism?
I think we can hope that. I think that I would actually frame it slightly differently. I 100% agree with your point about loss of US moral standing after the invasion of Iraq. And I talked about this a little bit in my book, which I know we'll talk about later, but I date the sort of apogee of Western military power to the moment we tried and failed to kill Saddam and his sons on the pre-dawn hours of the first morning of the war in Iraq, and it's all sort of been downhill from there. I think that the issue, that, as I would frame it, is actually an issue of populism. What we're seeing is a collapse of confidence in experts, elites, establishments of all kinds across most of the Western world, and partly that is a result of 20 years of failed overseas wars. Partly it's a result of increasing surveillance capitalism and authoritarian, panopticon behavior with respect to the war on terrorism at home. But I think fundamentally, and this is true in the EU as well as it is in the US, it's a perception by ordinary citizens of a degree of elite contempt for the working class and the middle class. So what we've seen, I think, in the last 2 years in the US in particular, is a shift away from a two-party system of Republicans versus Democrats to three poles of an elite establishment composed of the elites of both parties against a left populist pole represented by Bernie Sanders and a right-wing populist pole represented by Donald Trump. And I think that's a fundamental shift, and it's one that we also see in Europe. So I think that we're actually moving into a different dynamic where it's no longer going to be the so-called rules-based international world order of the liberal democracies against quote-unquote rogue states. It's going to be more multipolar with a Chinese pole, a Russian pole, European pole, and potentially a restored US center of gravity on that side. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I think that's certainly the goal of the establishment in the US right now.
I mean, certainly the rhetoric coming out of Washington is much more multilateral, and there appears to be a greater emphasis, once again, l'ancien régime, as you describe it, towards North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the various other international organizations set up after the Second World War. Do you think this means something?
Yeah, I do. I think that, you know, it was very clear that some of the people that were happiest anywhere in the world about President Biden getting elected was the leadership of Nato. And you just have to look at the statements made by individual leaders in the alliance, but more particularly people in the NATO structure about his election to see that. I think that certainly there's a view that the US is going to re-embrace some of the global institutions that President Trump moved away from. But I do think there's a limit to how far that that can go. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that much as President Trump wanted to have closer relationships with Russia, but wasn't able to because of domestic political pressure, where he was being painted as a Russian puppet, the same thing is going to be true for President Biden with respect to China. He may want to be back to normal détente with Beijing, but he's getting a lot of pressure internally for perceived closeness and personal relationships with the Chinese. So there's a limit to what he can do. And the reason I bring up China in the context of international organizations is that one of the Trump critiques and Pompeo critiques that was actually most legitimate was the view that China had hollowed out and begun to use for its own geopolitical interests these international organizations. Now, you could say, you know, that's because the US is mad because that's what they've traditionally done with these organizations. That may or may not be true, but the fact is that there's a sort of competition for ownership and control of the, what you might call the Bretton Woods institutions and the institutions of the international system. And I think that that's one area of global competition that we're going to see play out between China and the US under Biden, whether he wants it or not.
Interesting. And what you're implying is that regardless of the fact that both Trump and Biden are very, very different people with very different policies, both of them were in fact constrained in their international diplomacy by the American system itself.
I think that's very true. I think that, you know, as anyone that knows the US political system knows well, presidents don't get elected for their foreign policy positions. They get elected for their domestic policy settings by an electorate that doesn't really care very much about foreign policy, but they very quickly find in office that they have a lot more authority on foreign policy matters than domestically. The mistake that you often see people make, this happened to President Clinton, happened to President Obama, and I think if there's a risk that it'll happen to President Biden, is that they burn a huge amount of their political capital in the first year or two on domestic issues. They then lose heavily in the midterm election, and then they have very limited ability to do much after the end of the first few years of their term. So I think that's something to watch as we look at the progress here.
Now, I'd now like to move close to home, our home, and explore the US-China relationship and what it means for us in Australia. Now, there appears to be, of course, no let-up in Chinese activism within the region. We were broadcasting Australia's 14 sins by the embassy in Canberra militarizing the South China Sea, of course, crushing dissent in Hong Kong, and supporting anti-democratic forces in ASEAN countries, most recently, as we've seen in Myanmar. So how is the USA going to try and manage its relationship with China? Will it attempt to stand up to Chinese expansionism, do you think? Or will it accept that China has a legitimate claim as a new superpower to dominate its own domestic region? And if it does attempt to stand up to China, how will it do it?
Great questions. And I think I would agree with very few of the statements of former Secretary of State Pompeo, but one that I do agree with is his assertion that the contest for dominance between China and the US will be the defining contest in international relations in the next generation, and possibly will define the shape of the world this century. So I think it's an incredibly important question. I think that certainly the view of China in Europe and in the US and in Australia, although Australia had already gotten here earlier than others, has really shifted very significantly in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. And we're all very aware of the bullying behavior and abusive economic warfare that China has been inflicting on Australia for daring to have the temerity to try to seek some kind of independent examination of the origin of the COVID-19 virus. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because I think it's an important key to how we think about ourselves going forward. I think for the Americans, the goal will be to do away with some of Trump's very inflammatory rhetoric, but to actually pursue some of the key elements of his policies. So areas that will be areas of competition are all the ones that you mentioned, but I would add a few as well. A very big one is space warfare. As of last September, China now has a system that completely replicates GPS, which means that for the first time in history, there is a global power who has no stake in the continued existence of that US military space system that's actually fundamental to almost every aspect of the civilian economy worldwide now, and could knock it out at any point. The formation of the US Space Force, even though it was accompanied with typically Trumpian rhetorical flourishes of great ridiculousness, is actually a very serious move in a very serious competition that's likely to be something that shapes the planet significantly in the next generation. The Chinese have plans to put a permanent base on the moon by 2027. They already have a military space shuttle that was successfully launched and recovered earlier this year. As you know, there's now 3 competing Emirati, Chinese, and US Mars missions, all reaching Mars this month. So this area of space competition is a really big one. Another one is that the so-called tech war between the US and China over things like high-density semiconductor manufacturing, the access to rare earth minerals, the control over certain key commodities in the tech space. All of that is likely to continue and probably increase in intensity. And a third is the competition for technical standards, right? So determining what standards will be adopted for 5G and for quantum computing and for a whole series of advanced technologies that are emerging. And then a final one, and I don't want to freak people out, but I would suggest that even though the possibility that the COVID-19 virus leaked from a Chinese bioweapons lab is pretty low, and I don't believe that that's actually true, China does have one of the most active biowarfare programs on the planet, and any Chinese biowarfare officer would be guilty of professional negligence if they weren't looking at the impact of COVID-19 on Western economies, Western military forces, aircraft carriers being knocked out of action for a couple of months, Anderson Air Force Base in Guam being severely disrupted for several weeks, and think to themselves, if that's what happened as a result of an accidental release of a natural virus, imagine what could be achieved with a targeted engineered pathogen. And there is certainly a lot of ferment right now in the military space, thinking through the implications of that. So I think that the competition is going to deepen. I think it's going to expand into different areas. And I think that because of the domestic politics that we talked about earlier, even though President Biden's instinct is probably going to be for détente and a return to normal, there's going to be limited options for him to do that.
So fundamentally, you think they're going to stand up to it, or going to try to stand up to it?
Yeah, I think they will. And I think that the South China Sea, Taiwan, ports in Europe, weirdly enough, Africa and Latin America are going to be key areas of competition. And I think, in common with Australia, one of the key issues that people are dealing with is the incredibly close entanglement between the Chinese and the US economy, much as it is with the Australian economy. And also a particular feature in the US is the very close entanglement between the US political elite in both parties, Democrat and Republican, and the Chinese Communist Party. Dianne Feinstein, the senior Democratic senator, is a lifelong friend of Jiang Zemin. Mitch McConnell's father-in-law, Republican leader in the Senate, is an extraordinarily important businessman in China with close ties to the Communist Party. The Biden family's business dealings with the Communist Party are fairly well known, perhaps not as well known in America because of media censorship as elsewhere. So I think you're going to see that level of entanglement limit what the US can do. And you're going to have significant issues like US companies like Disney, Apple, Google, and organizations like the National Basketball Association. 3 out of those 4 entities lobbied against the act that was proposed to ban Uyghur slave labor in China. That's how closely they're following the Beijing line. So I think that it's not simply a matter of the US military standing up to the Chinese military. It's a matter of attempting to disentangle about 30 years of extraordinarily close enmeshing of the two societies and economies. And I think it's an open question about whether that's even possible.
What are the implications for us in Australia? Are we going to be an important part of whatever strategy the US embark upon vis-a-vis China? Or is there room for us to tread a more independent path?
I think very much the latter. And let me go back to the moment in April last year when Australia led the charge to hold China accountable for the outbreak of the COVID-19 virus. Australia didn't sit down as one of the small middle powers and wait for US leadership, as it would have traditionally done, nor did it side with the Chinese, as some people would argue we need to do because of where our economic bread is buttered. Rather, Australia rallied a coalition of a couple of dozen other medium powers and sort of led from the middle and showed that by upholding the international rules-based order, by partnering with other democracies and by exercising leadership as one among many middle powers, Australia really, managed to achieve something very significant. It had its negative effects for us, but it certainly showed that people will follow when we lead. I think it's worth pointing out that, Australia accounts for about 1/7 of the world's surface area. It has an economy the size of that of Russia. It's an extraordinarily important upper middle power. In fact, I wouldn't even call Australia a middle power going into the next decade or two. And I think we really have to get out of our defensive crouch, stop expecting the Americans to pat us on the head and tell us what to do, and start to act in a much more, in a way that's much more closely aligned with the reality of our economic, military, and geopolitical role. And I think that that's not a partisan statement. There are people in both parties, in fact, all parties in Australia that want to see that happen. I think we have to sort of shake off the assumption that the Americans are going to ride to the rescue. And I think if there's a silver lining in the experience of Trump, it is that perhaps we can free ourselves of that illusion about the United States.
That's really interesting. And I have got lots of other questions I'd like to ask you about that particular issue, but we don't have time. So what I'm going to do now is move on to discuss your most recent book, The Dragons and the Snakes, How the Rest Learned to Fight the West. Now, before moving specifically onto this book, I just want to say a few words about your writing generally, for those who perhaps aren't familiar with your work. Now, in my 37 years in the British Army, I was struck by how much operational experience was very highly valued for status and promotion within our organization, but how few officers reflected deeply on that experience, even or perhaps especially senior officers. Few people were able to draw upon their experience from one conflict and apply appropriate lessons to another conflict. So, for example, in southern Iraq in 2007, the British commander embarked on a release program of the Shia militia Jaish al-Mahdi prisoners as a confidence-building measure, because, and I quote, it had worked in Northern Ireland, not realizing, of course, the situation in Basra was completely different from that in Belfast, and that the released prisoners later all had to be killed or captured again later. Now, this is a roundabout way to highlight that what you do in your books is provide models of conflict and the world for people to understand what's happening, to understand the experiences that we've either had personally or have experienced viscerally through others, and to view them through a prism which allows them to apply appropriate lessons in different conditions. Now, you're one of the very few people I know who can do this. You see what's happening globally, then out of what could be viewed as just a confusing mess, especially when you're living in it, it's so bloody confusing. But you create an intellectual framework which allows others to understand what's happening and how to respond. So on behalf of all of us who think about such things, and not just the military, but anybody who's engaged in international relations and the study of conflict, thank you for your work. So, Dragons and Snakes. Could you briefly explain the central thesis?
Well, and to be suitably modest about your compliment earlier, this is a framework that I didn't actually come up with, right? So the title, The Dragons and the Snakes, is drawn from the testimony, the confirmation testimony of Jim Woolsey, who was President Clinton's CIA director. And in February 1993, about 18 months after the end of the Cold War, when he was giving that testimony, he was asked by one of the senators, how do you see the post-Cold War security environment? What's it going to look like? And he said, we have slain a large dragon, talking about the Soviet Union, but now we find ourselves in a jungle filled with a bewildering variety of poisonous snakes. And in many ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of. And he goes on and lays out his vision, which is incredibly prescient. And you can see it on the Intelligence Committee's website still, of all the issues that he said we were likely to deal with in the 1990s. And as a junior officer who lived through that period, I can say, his characterization of weak states, failing states, and non-state actors was a very accurate depiction of what we dealt with in that decade after the end of the Cold War. So I call those the snakes. The dragons, I had to add an extra dragon because of the Chinese. The dragons are strong state adversaries, right? So what Woolsey was basically saying was, it's a hell of a lot easier to deal with a single strong state adversary than lots of little non-state, weak state, or failing state problem sets. What I argue in the book is that in the 25 or 26 years or so since that period, the dragons have watched the snakes adapt. The snakes have gotten much better at acting like dragons. They've used advanced technology to acquire levels of lethality and precision and military capability that you used to have to be a nation state to acquire. I mean, you have, Islamic State running around with tanks and even a couple of working helicopters at one point in Iraq, acting like a state, thinking of itself as a state so this growth of non-state actors, snakes that act like dragons. But at the same time, you see things like the little green men in Crimea, or China's use of its fishing fleet as an adjunct to the Navy, or the penetration of academic and financial institutions in the West. And what you see is state actors that have learned to operate using similar techniques to non-state actors. So what I do in the book is I spend a bit of time framing it. I then have a chapter on theory, and I bring in a lot of ideas from evolutionary theory, population ecology, adaptive evolutionary anthropology, a bunch of other ideas to think about how evolution happens in a fitness landscape where you've got one big apex predator, and in order to survive, everybody has to adapt, which is essentially what's been true for everybody but the US ever since the Cold War. But then the bulk of the book is case studies, and I basically ask the question, how did the Chinese, for example, see the end of the Cold War? How have they evolved and adapted since? How are they reacting to this environment with the US as the dominant military player? What does it mean now? So I have a Russia chapter, a China chapter, a chapter on non-state actors, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Hezbollah, and others. And then I have a brief look at North Korea and Iran. So essentially my argument in the book is that the model that we would call conventional warfare, which was so dominant in 1991 that it forced everybody else to rethink their entire notion of warfare, has actually lost its utility because all of our adversaries have now adapted to the point where it doesn't really work anymore. And as I mentioned earlier, I date the beginning of the end and the sort of downturn to the beginning of the Iraq War. And if the 1991 Gulf War showed everybody how not to fight us, if you go up against the US or its allies in a conventional fashion, the outcome is going to be some variant of the highway of death. The invasion of Iraq showed everybody how to fight us, right? If you can blend into the environment, take a guerrilla or a terrorist approach, hide in urban terrain, network across continents with high-tech capability, it's very hard for us to see you, let alone defeat you. And so really it's a study of military adaptation and how the rest of the world learned to adapt in the face of this Western military dominance. And I basically argue that that model is now kaput. And I would suggest that a lot of the stuff we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation is very difficult to separate from these 20 years of failed military interventions that we've had internationally. If you have the smartest elites and members of the establishment and so-called experts repeatedly telling you that you have the best military in the world, and you already know it's the most expensive military in the world by far, and yet it can't deliver what it's claiming to deliver, at some point you go, you know what, these people don't know what they're talking about. And that sort of extends to a broader collapse of confidence in elites generally. And I do think that's part of what we're seeing now.
But if the rest of the world has adapted to Western military, US military dominance, and it's adopting all of these, or adapted to adopt all of these techniques which you describe in the book, presumably if the US itself then changed and did away with its tanks and aircraft carriers and all the rest of it, then they're simply going to adapt again, and anybody with half a dozen T-55 tanks is going to suddenly rule the roost again. So there was presumably a requirement to maintain the current dominance in what we might describe as the conventional sphere, whilst also adapting to the more unconventional sphere that you describe.
Yeah, that's very true. If we get rid of tanks and B-52s and nuclear weapons, the adversaries will get something that equates to those. Now, there are still very important barriers to entry for certain kinds of capability, particularly naval forces, high-end air forces, and anything nuclear or space related. But a lot of other military capability is now sort of democratized to the point where pretty much anybody can attain it given enough time and resources. So I do think that we can't simply move away from conventional. And in fact, the US does have global obligations and a global alliance system that it needs to defend and protect. So towards the end of the book, I come up with a series of what we call courses of action to think about how we might react. and we can talk about those in Q&A if you want to, but I think the general theme is we've got to start by recognizing that what we've been doing so far since the Cold War isn't working anymore. And we've got to think about ways to do things with a lighter footprint, more cheaply, with less expenditure of money and lives. And I also argue in the book for a more modest US international policy. I argue that the sort of 1990s idea of America as the exceptional nation. I quote Madeleine Albright in the book, who said, if we have to use force, it's because we're America. We stand taller, we see further than everybody else, and so we know what needs to be done. That's a verbatim quote. That argument's a lot harder to sustain. It barely passes the laugh test after COVID and Trump and Iraq and Syria and Libya and Afghanistan. And I think that the beginning of wisdom here is to pull your horns in a little bit and focus on resilience at home, which happens to be one of the leading NATO agenda items over the past several years, one that hasn't got a lot of attention from the US government until recently. But I hope that it does, and I hope that we in Australia focus on that also.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Russia now, and the evolution of their strategy and their actually expansionism as well. You describe this as liminal warfare. They're experts in liminal warfare in your book. What do you mean by that?
So I actually regret making that term up because about 3 months after I published the book, the British Army, who I've actually been working with on their concept development for a while, published a document talking about sub-threshold conflict. And liminal is just Latin for threshold. And I'm a big believer in never using a foreign word where an English word will do. Actually, it's probably a French word. The purpose, the point of liminal warfare is to say that the Russians have recognized that in a modern environment with pervasive smartphones, cameras, the internet, satellites, social media, it is impossible to be fully covert or clandestine. And instead, the best you can hope for is to be ambiguous for long enough to do what you need to do before an adversary can react. And I use the Crimea example and Georgia and a number of other cases to explore how they've evolved a particular style of operating, which is all about decisively shaping an adversary before the first tank rolls. And then when the first tank does roll, doing it in such an ambiguous and obfuscated fashion that an adversary can't really figure out what's going on in the moment and can't marshal resources to respond in time. They've really specialized in this particular approach. That's one element of the Russian approach. There are others, but I think it's one that does distinguish the Russians from, say, the Chinese, who are operating in a very different way in reaction to US dominance.
Do the Russians actually pose a significant threat to NATO through the Baltic states?
They absolutely pose a significant threat to the Baltics. I think whether that threat proliferates to the rest of the alliance is a very important question that's currently, a hot topic of discussion in Brussels and elsewhere. President Trump was not known for his perspicacity in geopolitics, but he did say a very sensible thing when Montenegro was invited to join NATO, which was that, we will probably come to their defense in the event of a conflict with the Russians, but the Montenegrins are very famously angry people, and who knows, they could get into some kind of conflict, and maybe we will and maybe we won't. And that led to pearl clutching horror on the part of the foreign policy establishment. But you could argue that actually what he's doing there is reacting to a very significant risk that's occurred now as a result of NATO expansion right up to the border of Russia, something that you might call a 2020s version of the 1930s problem of Poland, right, where France and Britain had given security guarantees to Warsaw that they were in no position to act on. They never provided any significant support to the Poles when World War II broke out, but it was the casus belli that led to the outbreak of war between those countries in Nazi Germany. And I do think there's a risk that an Article 5 situation, involving something that's not a core European or NATO interest could lead to a miscalculation and indeed a war, perhaps even a nuclear war with Russia. So I think that's a significant risk. But I do want to also point to the fact that NATO, as I said, has been really focusing not on expanding and competing and attacking Russia and being aggressive, but on this idea of resilience at home as the best form of deterrence. And actually Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and a number of the Scandinavian states, particularly Sweden and Norway, have really pioneered this notion of deterrence through resilience.
Yeah.
And the so-called thorn bush strategy, as it's talked about in the Baltics. And I think there's some goodness there, which NATO does well to focus on.
Now, I was going to ask a question about Iran, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to hold that. And I'd like to move on to my last question to bring this very wide-ranging conversation to a close by focusing very much at home. What can we do here in Australia to counter these types of threats, particularly the Chinese threat? Is it simply a matter of changing our military think about such things and organize themselves, or do we need a wholesale change of our national approach to strategy?
I think the latter. And the reason that I think that is because the Chinese challenge, I'm not going to call it a threat necessarily. Okay. The Chinese challenge is one that is posed in a way that we don't traditionally define as military. So we talked about liminal maneuver on the part of the Russians. What I talk about with respect to the Chinese is what I call conceptual envelopment, where they've broadened their concept of warfighting so far beyond our very narrow conventional view that a lot of what the Chinese regard as part of their unrestricted warfare or three warfares doctrine or their civil military fusion doctrine isn't stuff that we would even recognize as military. And even if we did, it's not clear that the Department of Defense would have the leading role in countering it. So I think, Home Affairs, PM&C, DFAT, Austrade, the state governments in particular, and defense all have really important roles to play in this notion of a big Australia policy as distinct from a forward defense or a defensive Australia policy. And I think if we do take that approach, it's going to require a fundamental rethink to no longer think of ourselves, for example, primarily as an Asian power, but also as an Indian Ocean, as an Antarctic power as well, to recognize that we've got very significant economic and other interests in Africa and Latin America, not just in Southeast Asia, not in any way to denigrate our relationship with Southeast Asia, but just to say it's part of a bigger picture. It's not the whole picture. I think we need to stop thinking of ourselves as being defined by our security relationship with the United States. I think we need to be much more self-reliant, much more assertive, take much more responsibility for events in our own neighborhood. I don't think that's a statement against the US. I think it actually makes us a more valuable ally to the extent that we're able to do that. But it does have implications. Things like a national ballistic missile theater defense capability, for example. Or what do we do if we can't rely on extended nuclear deterrence on the part of the United States? How do we protect our interests in places that are well outside our territory? These are all really important questions which we began to address at the beginning of the war on terrorism, but then we got sucked into Iraq and Afghanistan, and we've been basically servicing coalition commitments for the last 20 years. Now that those coalition commitments have diminished a bit and the world environment shifted significantly, I think we should shake ourselves a little bit, step back and say, okay, what next?
So we should stop producing defense white papers and start thinking about national security on a truly national basis.
Well, I think we should keep producing defense white papers, but it would be great if we had another national security paper in a similar vein to the one that we had several years ago, right? And I thought that the defense update last year was an extremely well reasoned and well argued piece of work on the part of DoD, but I would have loved to see that document located in a broader national security framework that it really wasn't, including industrial policy, education policy, health policy, that supports that broader approach.
David, thank you. I'm now going to pass over to Alistair, who's been curating questions. I see they've been piling up. So Alistair.
They certainly are piling up, well, as to be expected. So thank you, David. We'll get through, and I'll try and pass some of them together. But starting just on the US foreign policy, you talked about advocating a more modest US international policy. You talked about Madeleine Albright. The Biden administration seems to have received accolades for some of the experts that he's brought into his team. Are there any parts of that foreign policy team that give you hope, and conversely, any that give you concern?
I know almost all of his senior folks that are coming in pretty well from previously working in the US government. They are all well-meaning, excellent, very intelligent people who are very well informed about the problem set. There's no one in particular that gives me significant concern in the team. If I have two concerns, they're not about that. One is about the broader environment. I've already talked about that. There's limited things that a team, however brilliant, can do given the circumstances that US finds itself in now. The other one is that I really hope Kamala Harris is a fast learner because she has never really done anything in terms of foreign or defense policy, and she is one heartbeat away from the presidency now, and I hope that she, like vice presidents before her, is given the time and the space to actually learn rapidly to be ready for that kind of crisis.
Indeed. Looking more at our region, I think this brings the concept of the Quad into play. There are a couple of questions. Could you comment on the potential emergence of India into the Indo-Pacific discussion, and also the increasing role of Japan in geostrategic competition with China?
Yeah, so India, I apologize for neglecting to mention what I think is one of the most important, if not the most important powers that isn't China on the planet for the 21st century. And we've seen in the last year significant border conflicts between China and India. We've also seen some maritime conflicts and other competition. And I think that again, going back to this idea of a somewhat more modest US foreign policy, the notion of the Quad, which originated during the George Bush period, was, oh, let's invite the little Indians in with the little Aussies and the little Japanese and the Koreans, and they'll be part of our, well, the Indians are not into that idea, and nor should they be, I think. And I think a much more equal relationship was actually beginning to emerge between President Trump and Modi through personal relationships. I think that it would be a pity if the US now gives India a bit of the cold shoulder because of that. I think India is an extraordinarily important player that needs to be treated as much more of an equal in debates than it has been in the past by the Americans. In Japan, obviously, new government in Japan last year, sharply different points of view on a couple of key issues, economic and geostrategic. We've seen a number of conflicts between the Japanese and the Chinese, even since the new government came in. I think that one of the big opportunities for Australia now is a closer defense relationship with Japan. We've thought that for a long time. The Japanese have been a little bit reluctant at times to pursue that, but I suspect that's going to shift depending on what happens with the US-China relationship. One that you didn't mention that's not part of the Quad that I'll just throw out there as a point of concern is the Philippines, which is increasingly wobbling and coming into the Chinese orbit in some key areas, and something that we need to be understanding of the Philippines' point of view and to think about how to repair that relationship. The other one, which I think Australians often take for granted, but is a increasingly important area of effort for the Chinese, is New Guinea. And I think we really want to be looking at that northern area very carefully.
Absolutely. And of course, close, I mean, the Pacific Islands Forum is now looking rather shaky, and that's all areas where Australia should have an advantage in its own backyard. But how do you see that playing out with
Well, I think we should do in our region what I've been suggesting the Americans should do, and be a little bit more modest in our view of our Pacific partners, and stop actually thinking about it as our backyard, but think about it as a cluster of democratic states that we want to support and engage with. And I think part of that is not simply finger wagging and tut-tutting when people take money and investment and support from China when there haven't been offered a lot from anybody else. And I think that there's legitimate and illegitimate forms of engagement, and we need to be really careful about, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But I am very concerned about a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that's been going on in the Pacific Islands and in New Guinea. Spent a lot of time there in the last few years talking to people, and the extent of Chinese engagement, but Chinese Communist Party engagement in particular, is really concerning. Actually, I want to just make one point. I've been using China as a shorthand, and I know Richard has too. What we're actually talking about here is not Chinese people. We're not talking about China as a nation. I mean, Australia has, a long tradition of an incredibly valued Chinese community that's about 100 years older than the Chinese communist state, right? So we need to make a clear distinction here between the Chi-Com, Chinese Communist Party, and what it's doing, and China. And I think that China long-term needs to be an ally and a friend and a partner. But with this regime, it's extraordinarily difficult to see how that's going to happen without some significant changes.
Absolutely, and yeah, right to draw that distinction between China and the CCP. You talked a little bit about the entanglement economically between China and the US, and mentioned some of these personal relationships. I mean, could they be a force for good and provide some back channels for dialogue?
Absolutely, and I think they have been a force for good. There's a lazy sort of journalistic approach of saying, well, so-and-so is married to so-and-so and his father was, and yeah, okay, noted, 6 degrees of separation and all that. That doesn't necessarily mean anything nefarious has gone on. There are instances. I mean, Dianne Feinstein had a Chinese intelligence asset in her office for a number of years, for example. There's a congressman in the US Congress who's accused of having had a relationship with a Chinese intelligence agent. There's all that sort of stuff. Very similar to things that happened in the Australian Parliament 4 or 5 years ago. But I think that really the business community, the Asian American Chinese community in particular, and the increasing number of people that have a foot in both countries that are very well connected do play a really important role in terms of reducing tension and mitigating the risk of conflict. But of course, the flip side of that is there's also a risk that we'll just lie down quietly under CCP domination if we don't stand up. So I think there's a balance there.
Thank you. I'll just move on to Iran. We skipped over that earlier because of time, but there has been a question just on, how much is Iran a threat? And I think Richard's idea, is it both a dragon and a snake? And how do you see the JCPOA coming back onto the table with Biden administration?
Yeah, so the Iranians are not a threat in a conventional sense to the United States. They are a pretty significant conventional threat to Israel and to the Arab states in the Middle East. And the Trump administration's approach was to get rid of the JCPOA, which was seen in an extremely negative light by the Sunni Arab countries and by Israel, and instead to focus on building actually reinforcing an already existing de facto alliance between a number of Sunni Arab states and Israel. And eventually this was cemented in the last few months of the Trump administration in the Abraham Accords. And I think that was very transformative, right? It didn't get a lot of credit in the US, but the fact that you had the Saudis thinking about and the Emiratis and others engaging in a formal reconciliation process with Israel and operating as de facto allies against Iran is a very big deal. The other fact that the Palestinian people were taken out of the center of the Israel policy debate in the US and replaced by Iran. You can like that or not like it, but it was a very significant transformation to US policy since the 1940s. And I think these are big changes. And I think the instinct of people like Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken coming in is to simply go back to the JICPOA and to reinstitute that arrangement. I think they're already realizing that that's not going to work, partly because the Iranians are dramatically further along now than they were 3 or 4 years ago in terms of the nuclear program, because the Iranians have really expanded their footprint across the Middle East now and have really strengthened their stance, compared to where they were when the sanctions were lifted in 2015. And because, frankly, a whole series of very important US allies in the region are not going to wear it if we go back to what was done. The other thing that I'll point out is that among many other contradictions, one of the contradictions in the current US policy has to do with energy, whereby banning fracking in federal lands, closing the offshore reserves to oil and gas exploration, focusing much more heavily on renewables and much less on natural gas. US is actually going back to a previous set of circumstances where it was rather dependent on Middle Eastern oil and gas, which we all found as a very negative factor for the last couple of generations. And I suspect that US energy policy is going to run into US Middle Eastern policy pretty quickly because they're pushing at different agendas. And that's one that we really need to watch very closely. The UK and Australia in particular are extraordinarily dependent on oil and gas from the Middle East. And that's one area where we actually arguably should have a closer and more active interest in overseas engagements than we have traditionally.
That's very interesting. Just that leads on to climate change. Do you think the climate change policy is going to lead to potential conflict, or could there be some room for cooperation there between what Biden's trying to do and China's?
I think there certainly is room for cooperation on climate policy between China and the US, mainly because the US policy right now seems to be not to hold China accountable for its increased emissions, but to symbolically rejoin or join the Paris Accord and begin to focus on the so-called Green New Deal set of policies that emphasize renewables and move away from oil, coal, and natural gas. One area of interesting debate in the US on climate, which I think we could learn from a lot, is the discussion of nuclear energy in the US. So you've got Bill Gates in particular and others pushing the notion that at least as a transition, if not as a long-term solution, the only way to maintain energy production at a modern industrialized level while simultaneously reducing emissions is nuclear energy. Biden very conspicuously during the primary season was the only major Democrat candidate not to commit to doing away with nuclear power. So he seems to be quite open to the notion of a nuclear, particularly small-scale nuclear, as a component of the energy transition. I think that there are technological aids to solving this problem. But ultimately, the problem in America with respect to climate change is not that people see the same set of facts and disagree on the right approach to deal with those. In common with many other issues in the United States, it's almost as if there's a completely different reality for different parts of US society, and people just don't even agree on reality. So I suspect that any kind of coherence in US climate policy is going to be some time in coming.
We're going to risk running slightly over time here, possibly inevitable. If you would indulge us another couple of questions, perhaps, lots to go through. But again, just back to our region and potential flashpoints are talked about, whether it be South Korea, North Korea, whatever. But Taiwan comes up time and again. Concerns here is if China puts the squeeze on Taiwan, what would the US do?
I think that the US would fight in the event of a conflict over Taiwan. But I also suggest that the conflict would not be confined to the Taiwan Strait or the Western Pacific. And I don't suggest that it would necessarily go nuclear, but I think that you would see conflict in Africa, where China has very significant assets that are vulnerable to being targeted by the US, in Latin America, in Europe and elsewhere. And it would very quickly become a sort of global confrontation, not necessarily a military confrontation. It's worth pointing out that the Chinese, and I write about this in the book, the Chinese Navy as it exists today, at some level can be seen as a direct response to the third Taiwan Straits crisis of 1995-96, where the US actually sailed a carrier battle group and an amphibious task group between Taiwan and the mainland. And that freaked the Chinese out to such an extent that they've literally spent a quarter of a century building exactly the sort of Navy they would have needed to stop that happening. So I think that's not going to happen again, right? It's also worth pointing out that the DF-26, the most advanced Chinese anti-ship ballistic missile, can knock out a US carrier on the move at sea up to 2,500 miles away from the Chinese coastline. So basically anywhere west of Guam or north of about Timor. So we're dealing with a very, very large area of engagement in the event of a conflict over China, even if it doesn't go nuclear. So I think, you know, there's been a lot of debate in Australia about what side would we take in that conflict and what should we do about it. I think the more that you understand what that kind of conflict would look like, and the more that you realize how likely it is, the more it suggests that one of the top priorities of Australian policy going forward needs to be absolutely preventing that conflict from ever occurring. It probably needs to be one of our most important diplomatic and military priorities altogether.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm going to ask one quick question on Hong Kong and then come to a final one on Congress. So conscious that we are over time, but could you just talk briefly, given recent developments in Hong Kong, comment on the CCP's power and increasing influence there?
Well, it's very clear. In fact, the CCP's long had pretty significant influence in Hong Kong. The main difference, in my view, in the last 2 years, even really going back to the Occupy Central period of 2012 to 2014, is that the mask has come off. So instead of sitting behind a series of Hong Kong institutions, particularly the Hong Kong police and the legislature, we now have PLA directly deployed into the middle of Hong Kong City. We've got People's Armed Police units in Shenzhen. We've got a whole series of moves by the Chinese that make it very clear that the policy of indirect control is really a thing of the past. I think it's actually quite unlikely that the US is going to stand up to China over Hong Kong with any significant chance of success. So I think that the Chinese are going to continue to consolidate their control in Hong Kong. The one country, two systems policy is essentially dead. And I also think that along with Xinjiang and a number of other places, Hong Kong is the testbed for the new Chinese surveillance and social credit control system that we're seeing increasingly rolling out in other parts of China. And I think, you don't need to be rolling the tanks in a repeat of Tiananmen if you can prevent it ever getting to that point through omnipresent surveillance and people spying on each other and a corroding loss of trust within the community. And I think that's the strategy that you're likely to see. I'm watching very closely the trials that are about to occur of the dissidents, the 9 of them, who were just arraigned in the last week. And I think that's going to be a very interesting sort of bellwether of what we're likely to see going forward.
Thank you. And finally, and you can be as brief as you like on this one, just back to the US. Do you believe the Biden presidency has the potential to revive bipartisanship sufficiently to restore Congress as a constructive partner for foreign policy? No, absolutely not. I think we'll be lucky to avoid a full-blown insurgency in the United States in the next 4 years. So
I think that the chance of a bipartisan consensus on key areas of foreign policy is pretty slim. I think that the US may very well be turned inward, dealing with internal chaos for the next year or two at least. And I don't think that that means Congress is a viable partner. That doesn't mean individual Congress people are not, right? There are some great senators and great Congress people who are very well informed and very friendly to Australia and know a lot about the issues. And I think we should absolutely be engaging with them as much as we can. But Congress as an institution, I think has very limited likelihood of playing a constructive role.
Well, David, thank you very much. It brings us, unfortunately, to the end of our time. We could go on all evening, to be honest, but fantastic to get your insights. Thank you for making the time. Richard, can I ask you for the final word and sign off?
David, it's been a long time, and I look forward to our next time, which will be not after 20 years.
Yes,
so,
I hope so.
Thank you very much indeed. We've all really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
Thank you. And thank you all for the audience for such engagement. Good questions. Apologies if we couldn't get all through them, but we'll also send out a link to David's latest book when we send the recording. So David, thank you again. Stay safe.
Thanks, Alistair. Thanks, Richard. See you guys again.
Bye.
Bye-bye.